Today's lesson is about the Warren Court, and this is going to cover some of the key decisions of the Supreme Court from the 1950s and the 1960s. You're going to use the information in this presentation to complete the activity afterwards. So kind of give you a little bit of background about what the Warren Court is when we're talking about it, and we'll move on from there and talk about some of the most important cases. So first off, who's Earl? This is Earl Warren, this handsome gentleman here on the right side. Earl Warren is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1953 into 1969. That means he's kind of the head of what's going on in all the Supreme Court. During his time as Chief Judge, he is going to oversee some of the most important cases in American history, dealing with all kinds of issues we're going to talk about on the next slide. He is also the one that is responsible for leading the investigation over the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's known as the Warren Report. So he plays a number of important roles at the time. The Supreme Court cases that he hears, there are a couple key themes or ideas that stem from them. Number one, is going to address most of the segregation and civil rights cases at the time. And there's a lot of big ones, and we'll get to a lot of that next chapter when we're talking about civil rights, but you'll see a few of them here as well. He's also going to deal with a lot of cases that have to do with the rights of the accused, people that have committed a crime or convicted of committing a crime or accused of committing a crime. And so we'll discuss some of those. And it also deals with issues of freedom of speech and separation of church and state and a number of other things. So while he's in there, they hit a number of controversial issues that are super important. Now, when you do the activity that's after this, you're going to look at several of these court cases, and you're going to look at some scenarios or some situations, real life type situations, and you're going to see which of the court cases kind of fits with that or deals with that issue or deals with that particular scenario. So I'm going to run through some of the court cases that are big for its time. And they also, they all kind of have a little bit of a story behind them. We'll talk real briefly about what that story is with each one of them and what the verdict really means, okay? So among these really important or crucial court cases, none is probably more important than Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This is a deal where little Linda Brown was forced to walk to school across a railroad switching yard and in order to catch a bus and then ride a bus several miles just to get to school. It was a little bit of not just an inconvenience, but kind of a dangerous walk. Meanwhile, there was a white school that was just a mere block from her house. And so instead of going there, she has to go through all this deal and kind of walk through across the railroad crossings and all that deal just to get to school. Well, as it turns out, the feeling is after a while that, wait a minute, this is supposed to be separate but equal, right? It's okay, the Supreme Court has said it's okay for things to be segregated as long as they're equal. Well, this doesn't seem equal at all. Her situation is not equal to that of a white student. She doesn't have the same opportunity of receiving a good education because she has to go through that every single day and risks that kind of danger. Not to mention the school that she actually ends up at when she gets there isn't nearly as good. So they say this isn't separate but equal. This doesn't meet that standard. The Supreme Court hears the case and decides, and by the way, this is huge. This is 1954, still a ton of racist people, obviously, in the country. But the Supreme Court decides that, wait a minute, okay, this is wrong. And they order the desegregation of all schools. Now, this is before a lot of the important things that happened in the civil rights movement. This is before, like, Martin Luther King Jr. really gets a lot of momentum and before the Freedom Rides and all the other kinds of things that are going to come. So this is like this first crucial step. And because of that, it is huge. And the court deciding that they're going to desegregate the schools is a massive change in race relations in this country, probably more changes in that moment than has ever happened. It actually takes a lot of years for this to take hold, though. Many places throughout the country refuse to integrate, and it just takes a lot of time. And as you guys know, that this dialogue that continues on even till today. But that particular case is monumental. Another one that deals with segregation is the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. And basically, the Heart of Atlanta Motel was challenging the constitutionality of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which said you couldn't discriminate based on race. But the Heart of Atlanta Motel said we weren't going to let African-American people rent rooms here. And so that was kind of their deal. They decided they're a business. They have the right to refuse service to anybody they want. So they weren't renting rooms to Black Americans. So they decide that since the government's trying to make them do that, that they were going to take that up in the courts. The court actually rules against the hotel, saying that the U.S. does have the authority to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They can say that you can't discriminate on a basis of race or sex or religion or any of those things. And so that power has to do with the Interstate Commerce Commission. They say people from all over, traveling from all over, should be able to get a hotel anywhere. It has to do with the Congress's ability to regulate interstate commerce. So part of Atlanta Motel loses that, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is upheld there. On to some of the rights of the accused, and some really interesting stories with some people that commit crimes throughout the 1950s and take their issue to the court and win. Gideon versus Wainwright is a big one, because Gideon, this guy here shown on the right, doesn't exactly look like your typical criminal. He breaks into a pool room and was arrested. So he was arrested, he was brought in, but he doesn't have any money. He's too poor to be able to afford a lawyer. So when it comes to time to go to trial, he has to defend himself, and he is convicted. Well, they go back and say, wait a minute, this isn't fair. And he appeals this to the Supreme Court, saying, hey, I couldn't afford an attorney, and I'm supposed to be able to get a fair trial. Well, I can't have a fair trial if I can't have an attorney. And so he decides that because he can't, that's not really a fair trial. And so he takes it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agrees. They say, hey, listen, that's true. If you can't have a good lawyer, then you don't actually have a really fair chance. And the decision from the courts, from Gideon versus Wainwright, is, hey, everybody ought to have the right to be able to have a lawyer. So if you can't afford one, the state will be able to appoint one for you, and they'll get you a lawyer so that you actually can have a fair trial. And so Gideon versus Wainwright, his charges were actually dismissed, and that changes the way we do things. Anybody who is accused of a crime can get a lawyer, whether they can afford it or not. The state will appoint one. A similar kind of case happened with Escobedo versus Illinois. Escobedo is arrested in connection with a rape and murder that happened in, I believe it was Arizona. And he was at the police station, and they wouldn't let him see his lawyer. His lawyer actually showed up at the police station, asked to see Escobedo. They wouldn't let him in, and when he was being questioned, he was kind of being peppered, and eventually he confesses. Well, because he wasn't given access to his lawyer, he decides he's going to take this to the courts. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, wait a minute, no, that's not fair. If everybody's got a right to a lawyer, that means you got to let him see his lawyer. So everybody has that right to an attorney. You can't question them. You can't do those kinds of things unless they see the attorney. You see that all the time in the TV shows and the movies and everything, when they're talking about, a guy gets arrested. He's like, I'm not saying anything until my lawyer's here. Well, that's because of Escobedo versus Illinois that upholds this standard. So because of that, same idea as Gideon versus Wainwright, but just a little bit different. The one that many people know is Miranda versus Arizona, because you know a little bit about Miranda rights. Miranda's arrested in connection with a kidnapping and murder, and he doesn't really himself ask for a lawyer, but he eventually confesses to being guilty. But the problem is he didn't really understand what his rights are, how it worked with an arrest, and he didn't understand that he did have a right to a lawyer and didn't have to answer any questions without it. And so he appeals to the courts and says, listen, I didn't know that I didn't have to answer those questions. I didn't know that I could have a lawyer. And so this is where it comes down from the Supreme Court, and they say, okay, well then that's fair. If you don't know what your rights are, then that's fair. And so the Supreme Court says, yeah, okay, that's got to be a thing. This is where they establish something called Miranda rights. Miranda rights mean that your rights have to be read to you. You have the right to remain silent, all that kind of stuff, before you're taken into custody, so that you understand what your rights are. And those Miranda rights exist. They read those rights to you because of what happens here with Miranda versus Arizona and winning that case. One more that has to do with the rights of the accused is Brady versus Maryland. This was a story of a robbery gone wrong. And when robbery goes wrong here in this particular case, it ends up in murder. Now, Brady himself really wasn't the murderer. He was kind of more of an accomplice to it. But as he was being charged with kind of being associated with it, and he confesses to that while he's being questioned. As it turned out, his accomplice, the guy that worked with him and actually committed the murder, he had already confessed to police. And the problem with this is that had Brady known that this other guy confessed, that probably would have changed how he decided to answer those questions. And so he didn't have all the information. And so because he didn't have all the information, he said his trial wasn't valid because that wasn't fair. He wasn't given all the evidence. They weren't given all the information. And they actually did not grant his appeal. They said, okay, no, you're still guilty. Everything's going to go. But it did confirm this idea, and the Supreme Court did say that due process needs to be followed. So if there is evidence that that is important to the outcome of the case, the defense needs to know about that evidence, and that the accused need to know about that evidence. You can't just keep them in the dark. And that's kind of what happened in this case. Now they don't go back on anything. They don't accept his appeal or anything else like that. But the Supreme Court does acknowledge that that in the future they do have that right, due process. One more of the accused is Mapp versus Ohio. A bunch of police showed up at Mapp's house and wanted to search without a warrant, and she wouldn't let him in. So they go away, and then they come back a little bit later and like, hey, yeah, now we're coming in to search now. And she's like, I need to see a warrant. And they forcibly enter the house. They basically shove a piece of paper in her face and say, yeah, here's a warrant. She doesn't even get to read it or see it or anything. She rips it out of their hands, trying to take it. And so they basically tackle her to the ground and take it from her. And so they didn't give her really the chance to properly see that she had a warrant, or that they had a warrant to search her place. Well, once they search, they find evidence that would convict her. Okay, they found some of the stuff that they were looking for, and she was arrested. And as a result of that arrest, she's like, wait a minute. I don't even ever know that they had a warrant. They never proved that they had a warrant to me. They just waved a piece of paper in front of my face. So she appeals. The Supreme Court hears that and they say, you know what? She's right. The evidence obtained in this search was illegal because they didn't follow the right rules, and it's inadmissible. That means that the Fourth Amendment, that you can have no illegal searches or seizures, that's upheld, and say, hey, you gotta be able to serve that warrant, and you got to be able to do that properly and show a person and give them the opportunity to recognize that warrant in order for them to be able to enter and be able to search that premises. So again, another victory for the rights of the accused. Switching gears to the last couple ones, Tinker versus Des Moines is a little bit different. This is a free speech one. There were a bunch of students and parents that organized war protests for the Vietnam War, and they were going to do so by wearing black armbands to school. Well, the school found out about it. They're like, no, you do that, we're going to suspend you. You try to wear one of those black armbands, we're going to suspend you. And so pretty much everybody backs down except for these two here, the brother and sister. Last name is Tinker. And so the Tinkers decide they're going to go ahead and they're going to wear their black armbands anyway, and the school suspends them. Well, it comes back and they say, wait a minute, this violates the rights of free speech. And so they come and they say, hey, this is freedom of speech. This is protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution. You're violating this. And the Supreme Court heard this case and came down in their favor and said, that's correct. This is free speech, and they absolutely have the right to be able to do that. And a school cannot inhibit that in this case. So it was a big victory, not only for protesters during the Vietnam War, but for free speech in general. And then finally, Engel versus Vitale. The New York State Board of Regents wrote this prayer that they recommended that every school in the state of New York say. And the kids would say it each and every day. They didn't have to, it was voluntarily, but this kind of gave them this prescribed prayer that they say every single day. A parent in New York said, no, you're not doing that. They sued and said, hey, wait a minute. This is a violation of the separation of church and state. Okay, they should be able to go to school without having that religion kind of being part of that or being that closely related to it. So it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, we understand it's voluntary, and the prayer itself was non-denominational. It wasn't like a specific religion or specific belief or denomination. They said even still, by the state saying, here's a recommended prayer, that was crossing a line, and that is unconstitutional. And school-sponsored prayer of any kind would be a violation of that First Amendment right, which is a huge landmark case in deciding what the separation of church and state really means in our country. So these are the 9 cases that you're going to use to be able to complete the activity. If you don't understand them, one of the things that I did is I put this PowerPoint so that you can refer to it back into your Google Classroom so you can kind of page through. And you will also receive a little packet that has a description of these cases and to help you. Now, when you get your chart, what it's going to have is it's going to have a scenario. It's not what happened in the case, okay? It's a different scenario. It's like a scenario that could happen any day today, right? And so you read the scenario and you want to decide which of these cases, which of these 9 cases is dealing with the same issue. Which case has to do with this little scenario? That's what so you read the scenario and understand that's a real life example. Then you're going to figure out which case it has to do with of those 9. And that's what you're going to write in that middle column. What warrant case did this situation violate? The last part, the second part of the worksheet then is, okay, so what was the ruling, or how did this violate what was decided in that case? What's the problem here? What in this scenario did the court case that we studied in the Warren Court, how did that clash with that? Okay, so you're going through each one and you'll read it, and maybe you can't figure out one from the start. If you can't figure one out or not sure what case that goes with, maybe skip that one and come back to it later when you've got a few more eliminated, and you can kind of come back to it. All right, but you're finding which court case matches with which one. There are 9 scenarios, there are 9 court cases, so there'll be one per. And then make sure you describe in that last column how that doesn't quite match up. What was the problem, or how did it violate that? Okay. So again, you've got these slides in your Google Classroom. You've got the descriptions. You can go through. You can sort of work a little bit together to try to come to these answers, and figure out which Warren court case matches up with this. All right, good luck, and we'll see you tomorrow.